I think the Israelis will largely be looking to dominate the above ground space, ideally isolate Hamas into the tunnel network, and then deal with them popping out every now and again when they have to.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest situation in Gaza with military analyst, former fighter pilot and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, welcome back to Frontline.
Morning, James.
Just want to start with the latest news, which is, of course, this deal that appears to have been struck between Israel and Hamas for a pause to allow the release of hostages. Clearly, that is one of the big humanitarian objectives of the Israeli government. But from a military perspective, what do you think this pause or this truce will actually mean?
Well, firstly, it's been extremely difficult to negotiate, hasn't it? And I think we've got to unpick that slightly to understand why. One of the reasons is there's 238 hostages, or so we believe, but there's three categories of hostages, one of which is the women and children, the innocent civilians, as it were, there. The second one is the foreign nationals. The US has got probably 10 US foreign nationals unaccounted for. The UK apparently has got a couple as well. And then the third category is the sort of IDF, Israeli Defense Force, military personnel. Now, so far, the conversations negotiated on behalf by Qatar as a third party have all focused on the women and children. And it's questionable how many there are of those, depends on how you categorize children, what age they have to be. But there may be up to 75 of those, but they've categorized, they're going to release 50 of them. Now, from an Israeli perspective, they do not want to take their foot off the throat of Hamas to negotiate or to pause. But Hamas clearly want to create as much of a window as possible because that way it becomes more and more difficult for the Israelis to start up again, because it isn't just about the hostages, it's all about the humanitarian relief. And as we've seen since the 7th of October, the number of Palestinian deaths in Gaza is up at north of 13,000 now. Now, admittedly, that's according to the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority. But actually, in older conflicts, they've been pretty accurate. And bluntly, when you look at the number of buildings that have been leveled, it's quite possible that number will be significantly higher. Now, as a result, if you have a humanitarian pause, it gives more opportunity to provide aid to those who are sick and injured. The international community will become more and more shocked by the state of that, and it'll become more and more difficult for the Israelis to move forward. So even brokering this was going to be very difficult. Now, what we understand has been agreed is 50 people over a period of 4 days. Drip feed them out, but there is the latitude to extend that window if more hostages can be released. And you can expect to see Hamas want to exploit that. A couple of really critical things, though, one of which is, when does it start? Because to start these things, you need to communicate with everybody on the ground. The comms are very bad in Gaza at the moment. How does Hamas know that it's communicated with everybody? And also, it's not just Hamas there. There's Islamic Jihad, which are also another group that actually hate each other. How are they going to coordinate to make sure there's a robust ceasefire? So it's very difficult to coordinate that. And secondly, Hamas will not want to show where these hostages are being held. So getting them out from wherever they are will involve tunnels, creeping around, blindfolds, deception plans. How do you integrate then the International Committee, the Red Cross, who are going to be facilitating this? And of course, the fragility of this will be incredibly difficult to manage, because one shot gets fired and it's a tripwire. Everybody starts firing at each other again. And now the hostages and the Red Cross are in grave danger. So it's an incredibly sensitive, difficult scenario. And let's be blunt as well. There's lots of headlines at the moment that seem to herald the end of the war. This is not the end of the war. Israel has been very clear. Its objectives are to destroy Hamas. That's not been done yet. And to free all the hostages. It's great news that some are coming out, but just imagine you're the families of those who don't get released. Chatting to one of the Israelis last night over at Sky, and incredibly moving. You're waiting for his mother to come out. And you imagine now you're waiting each day. Is she coming out with this 10? Is she coming out next? Or she might be tomorrow's 10 coming out, and then a shot's fired, or Israel says, no, we're not going to continue this anymore. Incredibly difficult for all the families involved. And that's, in a way, is how Hamas uses these hostage situations to pluck at the heartstrings. It's about the only ace they have. They can't defeat the Israeli Defense Forces militarily, but the hostages, they've used those very effectively in the past. Last point on that is that you might recall that about 20 years ago, they held an Israeli Defense Force soldier for 4 years. They eventually swapped his release for, I think it was 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. So it just shows you what value that one individual had. And one of those prisoners that was released was Yahya Sinwar, who is now the Hamas commander in the middle of Gaza.
And Sean, a 4-day truce, humanitarian pause, I suppose the military fear the Israelis will have is that that allows Hamas time to regroup. What will they be doing? What will Hamas be doing in those 4 days?
Well, there's no doubt they've been on the back foot militarily. Let's go back. I think the 7th of October, it was horrendous what the activity, but they had clearly planned it very, very well. And by planning it well, they must have also known what, having provoked the bear, what was going to come at them. And therefore, the tunnels, the preparations for all of the hostages, all seems to have been done extremely effectively. But if you look back in history, it's very hard to believe that Hamas would have believed that the Israelis will come so hard, so heavy, and bluntly declare war on Hamas rather than just seeking retribution. Because as the casualty figures have risen, even the international community is getting cold feet now because it's no longer proportionate. 1,200 people died on that fateful day. We're now at least 10 times as many, potentially significantly more. And it's not entirely convinced that Hamas was prepared for that level, but they'll want to survive. And one of the things that most military experts believe is that the tunnel network, the Gaza metro underneath Gaza City, will still be a very effective way of irritating the Israelis, but it's about the limit of what you can do. But it also allows them to flee south into Khan Yunis, which of course is the regional stronghold of Yahya Sinwar. And so eventually, if IDF want to destroy Hamas, they're going to have to go south. The problem is of course, the IDF have told all the civilians to move south, so it's gone from a already heavily populated area to an incredibly densely populated area. So that will make life very difficult. And that's what Hamas will be desperately seeking to do, make life as difficult as possible for the Israelis, because all Hamas has to do to win is to survive and to hold a few hostages. I know that sounds horribly blunt, but that will be seen as success by Hamas. And they, at the moment, it looks like their strategy is paying off.
At a time of recording, the humanitarian pause has not begun. Israel is still carrying out attacks on Gaza from land, air and sea. How would you sum up the progress of the IDF's operation thus far?
Wow, that's an interesting question, isn't it? If I, as a military guy, before you start any operations, I've been involved in invasion of Iraq, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Every time you're involved in a military operation, you sit down with your politicians and find out what are the objectives. What do you want the military to achieve? What does good look like at the end? Because as soon as you unleash the dogs of war, it isn't just the military that suffer, it's also civilians and infrastructure around as well. So you want to be really clear that you understand what your military masters want. On that fateful day on the 7th of October, it doesn't look like the Israelis paused, had a really good think, had a really good study at their options and what their military objectives were going to be. It felt very much like do something immediately, get bombing, and it driven largely by anger. Now, I do understand that, but from a military perspective, it doesn't look like there were clear military objectives. Now, as it's gone on, they've talked about 3, seize Gaza City. They haven't done that yet, but I suspect over the fullness of time, the tunnels will prove more difficult, but largely control Gaza City. But in terms of the other 2, destroying Hamas and liberating all hostages, I have to say they don't seem to be any closer today as they were at the start of this operation, despite the fact there's huge numbers of casualties, Palestinian casualties, and the humanitarian situation is spiraling out of control. And it doesn't seem that they're going to be able to, it's going to get harder, not easier, as they go on. The harsh difficulty from a military perspective is this is not solvable by military means. It's just not. It's without getting to the history of it all, there's been friction and unrest, but whatever the solution is, it's going to need senior statesmen to sit down and work out how on earth people can live together. And humanity needs to be at the center of this rather than polarizing the conversation around religious beliefs, history, or whatever. Because it's the frustration about, I also do commentary about the Ukraine conflict. And without being too flippant, it's good guy versus bad guy. Russia invaded, whatever the merits of it were. It's completely different with the Israel-Hamas-Palestinian war because it's so polarized, marching on the streets of London, everything. And it feels horribly like a football match. You go along and you can't just admire the match. You have to support one side or the other, and you have to be vigorous about your support. Whereas that has led inexorably to the attacks on the 7th of October, the spiraling death toll. And tragically, I listened to an expert from the humanitarian relief organizations, and they said traditionally the deaths caused by the military action get dwarfed ultimately by the humanitarian casualties because the lack of power, the lack of treatment for perfectly treatable injuries, the lack of ability to protect people from diseases, from dysentery, from poor running water. There's just a whole list of things that the casualties that result from that will almost certainly dwarf the number that have been caused by the military means. All of that is a direct result of the military action. So circling back to how well are they doing, given the fact that it's an impossible task, I think they are making progress, but it seems inevitable that they will get bogged down with a rising tide of casualties, a growing unrest. Remember the 7th of October, the US, the UK all roundly supported Israel's right to defend itself. The language is a lot more measured now. The international community is getting more and more nervous that isn't a blank check for Israel to wreak devastation on Gaza. And I think there's a lot more questions being asked now. Very difficult.
But I mean, President Biden has made clear that he supports Israel's objective of eliminating Hamas. Now, whether that is feasible, I suppose, is another question. In terms of the tactics they're pursuing, the IDF, clearly they want to try and deal with this tunnelling network, the Gaza Metro, as you referenced, Sean. How do you do that? How do you approach that? Because there are so many tunnels. Israel will have identified some, but entering them because they might be booby-trapped, they're using sniffer dogs in some instances. How do you approach trying to clear these tunnels?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a job I would have liked to have had as a military guy. You remember the island hopping campaign in the Pacific in the Second World War? The choice was either to fight every island or just bypass them. There is a view that actually you just seal off the tunnels and gradually force people out through hunger and deprivation. Those tunnels, Hamas has had decades to prepare them. There's a labyrinth, arguably over 400 kilometers of tunnels. I mean, it's just amazing. They've got power, communications, water, food, headquarters areas, sleeping areas, cooking areas. So they're going to be very self-sufficient down there. And there's blast doors all the way along. And, of course, if you don't know where they are, they'll all be mined. They'll all have booby traps along them. So getting dragged into those will be incredibly difficult. I think some areas the IDF will use sniffer dogs. They'll use drones. They'll use little robots. But I'd be very surprised if it's a priority to go in and actually clear them. And that's part of the problem, is that if the hostages are being held in areas down there, it's very difficult to get them out unless you go in. And if you go in, you're going to suffer huge casualties along the way. And that's why I say it's quite a difficult nut to crack. But for now, I think the Israelis will largely be looking to dominate the above ground space, ideally isolate Hamas into the tunnel network, and then deal with them popping out every now and again when they have to.
And it's that point about the hostages probably being in the tunnelling network that I suppose makes it hard for them just to seal them off or collapse them in on themselves, which otherwise might be the tactic the IDF would use.
Yes, and again, we have to be very careful here because I have respect for the families of those hostages that are there, but how much does Hamas really care about the health of the hostages whether they've got 100 or 10 doesn't really make a great deal of difference to them. And we've seen both sides in this conflict play the media war very effectively, blame each other for atrocities. I'm sure we'll get onto the hospitals, but and therefore hostages become part of that bargaining chip. And it's particularly going to be difficult, I think, for the military hostages, because I would imagine they're not being treated well. And I'd imagine they'll be bottom of the list for any talk of release and the like. And therefore, the Israelis, who will not want Hamas to dictate the pace and the terms and have the initiative, are largely going to ignore that. And I think that's been the frustration around this conversation around the release of hostages now, is that you sort of hand the initiative to Hamas and they can dictate how many they release. They can dictate, right, well, extend another day, you'll have 10 more. And that will not be how Israel wants to be dictated to. They want to get on with the military operation. And whilst they say that release of hostages is important, absolutely it is, but destroying Hamas is probably their first priority. And it's very difficult to have two equal priorities. So, but time will tell.
We'll come on to the fighting around the hospitals in a moment. I just wanted to ask you, Sean, about Hamas moving around above surface level at night and what Israel might be doing to try and identify that and sort of target them. I know they've been using flares. They've also been using night vision goggles. What are the relative merits of those?
Yeah, there's a lot of... one thing to remember is that Israel is a very capable, very well-equipped military force. It's got Army, Navy, Air Force. It's got satellite technology. It's got access to US. So it is very, very connected up. It can use technology, whereas Hamas is much more hand grenades, pistols, and booby traps. So if you're the Israelis, you're trying to find ways to bring to bear your advantages. Now, above ground, you can use satellite technology, you can use tracking mechanisms, you can intercept communications, lots of things that probably Hamas don't have the ability to do. And one of the things that when the ground offensive was happening from the Israelis, they probably didn't prioritize the tunnel network, but that meant Hamas were going to pop out this tunnel network, dart around, use anti-tank weapons, and then run back to the tunnels. Now, to observe that, you therefore have 24/7 satellite imagery, and you also have 24/7 drones around that are providing real-time imagery. Now, some of those will be in the visual spectrum, some of those will be infrared, and therefore, given that some of the soldiers, particularly some of the snipers, will have infrared goggles on because the Israelis won't want to be seen themselves when they go in, and having used goggles when I've been flying jets at night, they're very good, but they're quite heavy. I mean, the ones we carried on a helmet were sat on the front of the helmet, so your back of your neck was aching by the end of the trip. I noticed that the Israeli soldiers ones have the batteries on the back and the goggles on the front, so they're more balanced, but they're heavier. So they're quite uncomfortable to use, but they only work in very, very low light. As soon as you put flares up, and we've seen the artillery, Shmuli flares that are coming down like corkscrews. They're on little parachutes. They fire through artillery shells, then come down over the battlefield, take a while to come down. There to try and catch out the Hamas fighters who've come above ground, sneaking around in the dark. Suddenly, those flares turn it to daylight, and they suddenly feel incredibly vulnerable. So most of the Israelis will not have those night vision goggles, because as soon as you put a flare up, those goggles just literally ramp down. You can't see anything through them anymore. But a combination of the two undoubtedly is going to prove very, very effective against Hamas. But I reiterate, it's only in the above ground fight. But given the fact that Hamas are using those tunnels to pop out, take a pot shot, hijack, ambush the IDF and then dart back down, that's how the IDF are trying to combat that.
Let's come on to Israel's targeting of hospitals in Gaza with the justification that they're used as a sort of human shield and that the civilian infrastructure is protecting military infrastructure for Hamas. First of all, what do you make of that argument?
First of all, I've been involved. I'm one of these sort of veterans of 25 years of conflict, and because we've not fought wars of national survival for 80 plus years, largely our wars have been wars of choice, and therefore we have tried very hard to respect hospitals, keep well clear of them, and particularly counterinsurgency, which is what Afghanistan was about, is about hearts and minds. If you start killing the locals as well as the bad guys, you quickly lose support. So I'm used to an organisation and an international society where you don't go anywhere near hospitals. Of course, that's been completely reversed in the conflict in Gaza, largely because it appears that the IDF are utterly convinced that Hamas are using these tunnels underneath hospitals to hide weapons, to hide headquarters, planning buildings, because they know that the IDF couldn't attack them. And therefore, by goading the Israelis into those areas, the hope is that it shows the Israelis as being inhumane and therefore undermining international support for Israel. And we've seen a bit of that, haven't we? We've seen questions being asked, front page news about, is this reasonable? It's a war crime, whatever. From the IDF's perspective, given that they're convinced it's happening, they've either a choice of either ignoring it or actually going in, finding the proof and showing people. And I think we've seen that over the last few days. We've started to see the IDF expose what they thought were explosives and intelligence in an MRI suite. Now, from a military perspective, is that compelling? No, it's not a lot of weapons, and weapons are more freely available in Gaza than they are in Surrey or in London. So we tend to be shocked, but the reality is there's a lot of weapons about. The next degree was they started showing a tunnel that came up under Al-Shifa Hospital, 10 meters deep, 55 meters long, blast door at the end of it. The Israelis didn't go in, but they put a drone in there and a sniffer dog to show the tunnels. That's more convincing because the Israelis couldn't plant that. That has to have been built, and a tunnel leading into the Gaza metro controlled by Hamas. It's got no place to be in a hospital grounds. Is it, however, compelling evidence that they were using it for storing weapons and the like? No. But if we're looking for a binary, is it or is it not? Difficult. On a sliding scale, it's a growing body of evidence that Hamas are using these tunnels. They also released a bit of footage about 2 hostages being taken into the hospital grounds. I think that was exposed at the same time. Again, unfortunately, they blurred out the face of the hostages, understandably, but it means that nobody can check to see if they genuinely were hostages. And it was designed to shock because you see people with guns going to hospital. But let's put into context, this is the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority. Hamas are taking injuries. It's entirely reasonable that Hamas take their injured soldiers into hospital. And if you're taking your injured soldiers, you're going to be carrying a gun in when you do that. So we've got to be quite careful here to look at these objectively rather than listening and taking at face value everything the Israelis say. But there's no doubt it's been an absolute shock for the residents, and it's an assault on the senses. It just doesn't feel appropriate to be attacking hospitals, but that's the nature of this conflict at the moment.
And when approaching these hospitals, we've seen footage of tanks near Al-Shifa Hospital, Al-Quds Hospital, and others. Do you just talk me through, Sean, the difficulty of using tanks in built-up areas, particularly in somewhere like Gaza, where there is already a lot of damage sustained?
Yes, I mean, tanks are their own in more open ground because obviously you can see targets somewhere where you can use laser rangefinders, you can pretty accurately fire shells. They're very, very good, and of course they provide a degree of protection. As soon as you're into an urban area, every street corner, you can't see around it, and somebody can jump out with an anti-tank weapon, fire it, and then hide again. So they're quite vulnerable to those sorts of weapons. If you use them with a lot of infantry, then they can be very helpful because if, for example, the Israeli Defense Forces are making their way through a part of the city and then there's a load of Hamas fighters in one building, option one is that the IDF have to fight their way in there, and that will be incredibly dangerous, incredibly difficult for them to do. And of course, they might end up with a whole load of booby traps waiting there, and the Hamas might jump down a tunnel and blow up the building behind them and blame the Israelis for doing it. So incredibly difficult. Another option is to actually take out that building. Now, you can do that with airstrikes. The trouble is the bomb comes in from the top, and it might be in the basement that you actually want to take these guys out. A tank can fire a round straight into the basement, or at least into the ground floor. So, and of course, provide a bit of protection behind which the fighters can get closer. So they have a role, but it's not a traditional role. Generally speaking, to go into the urban environment, it's an infantry role, and in some respects, you were asking earlier how well the Israelis have done. If you look at Bakhmut going to Ukraine, admittedly, it was a lot of ex-convicts fighting. But if reports are to be believed, the Russians lost about 30,000 soldiers fighting their way to clear Bakhmut, because it favours the defenders because they're just tucked away. And if you're not good at what you do, you lose a lot of people. And the worry was the Israelis going into Gaza City left them open to an environment where their military advantage was now negated, and Hamas had the advantage because they were defending. In reality, we don't know the number of casualties from the IDF, but it still seems to be below 100 at the moment. And that's very low given the nature of that style of operation. So they do seem to be using tanks, drones, infantry very effectively against a Hamas, which are largely just popping up, firing, and then jumping down again.
We will have to see, Sean, how this truce, how this humanitarian pause plays out. We would expect fighting to resume after. Certainly that's the stated aim of the Israelis. From an equipment point of view, how well equipped are Hamas to continue this fight? I know they have actually been receiving some munitions by sea even. How long can they last?
And that's a great question. I mean, part of this was how big's their stockpile? They're probably not getting many weapons coming in as we speak. There might be a drip feed through the tunnels. There might be some stuff overnight, but it seems unlikely that they're getting large quantities. But for example, there were reports they had over 100,000 rockets, and they've undoubtedly got huge stockpiles of bullets and stuff like that. And the slight challenge, I think, is that Israel would have known the sort of weapons that Hamas would have. But given they've been planning this for so long, given that they are sponsored by Iran, who also sponsor Hezbollah as well, it is entirely feasible that Iran's given them a few sexy weapons as well, which they wouldn't have expected to have to catch out the IDF when they come in. So, but it goes back to my earlier point. Hamas were very well prepared for this offensive, but what sort of offensive and for how long? And I'd be quite surprised if they expected that Israel would go declare a war of national survival against Hamas that would actually rip into buildings, would be pursuing Hamas relentlessly. And therefore, there must be a point at which their weapons start to they get fewer weapons as they go. But let's be also clear, if they're in the tunnel network, they've got a degree of protection because Israel won't want to go in. So it's not going to necessarily be a highly attritional, kinetic conflict. They will leave explosives lying about and the like. And that's probably why the casualty figures for Israel have remained relatively low, because actually they're doing some fighting, but there's lots of delaying tactics rather than actually a full-blooded defence.
And just finally, Sean, is there anything that you're not hearing about the military side of this conflict that you think needs to be discussed more?
Well, I always think with these military things, it's what you don't know rather than what you know. For example, a few weeks ago, we found out the Americans were using long-range unmanned air systems to provide intelligence, and we weren't aware of that up till now. America had given the illusion that they were there to stop other players. 2 carrier groups in the Med, a nuclear submarine, all designed to stop Iran overstretching itself, but not actually getting involved in the conflict. Then you hear that if the drones are being used in the conflict, what else is being used? What else is available to Israel? Because obviously it's a very close relationship between the US and Israel. But the danger is also you're trying to overthink this. I think from my perspective, the Israelis, even if Hamas had 20,000 fighters, and that's more than most people think they have, that's about 5% of what Israelis got available. If you look at the weapons, Hamas is no match militarily at all. So this would never be a truly military conflict. It would be David versus Goliath. What Hamas is doing is fighting an asymmetric fight. It's fighting dirty. It's fighting in the way to try to survive and survive with some hostages. Because if it does that, even though it'll be stood in the ruins of Gaza, it will claim it's won. The tragedy, from my perspective, is that this was never going to be solved by military means. History has shown that, and yet they both piled in to create a military thing. And also, when you look at Gaza, 2.3 million people, had an unemployment rate of over 50% before the conflict, steadily degrading quality of life. As a petri dish, it's for people to get, upset, angry, frustrated. And there's no justification for what happened on the 7th of October. But you can see how the population was going, what future have we got? Now, after this conflict, a load of Gaza's been leveled. How's it going to be rebuilt? How the Palestinians going to be lifted out of this? And how do you stop this further polarizing two sides when humanity is what's losing out in the middle? We live in this country I don't ask what religion you are. I don't care. I respect the fact you may have your own religion, but we live by a set of values in this country. Yet all of a sudden in there, it's all about religion. If you're one side or the other, I hate you. And you go, somehow, it is different, but in Northern Ireland, we had a similarly polarised view. It takes generations to solve, and given the fissures that have been formed, the scabs that have been formed, it's going to take a lot more engagement than just Netanyahu and Hamas. This is going to be global international politics, and we need some big statesmen to step up and help sort it out.
Sean, we always appreciate your insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Great pleasure, James.